Hey, my name's Jonathan Hadel, and I make music as Pink Buddha, and welcome to Force Fridays, where we look at some tips and tricks for how to better use the Force. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you don't want to miss out on the series. Today's video is going to be on two different ways that you can chop samples on the Akai Force. The first method we're going to look at is what I might call the classic chop, because it's the classic MPC sound, where you take a longer sample and you chop that into a number of different pads. Primarily they're going to be sequential nature, so they're going to move from one to the next by quarter note or by half note, and they're going to be choked so that when you play one pad and you move to the next, it immediately stops that other pad from playing. I use this method when I want to simply chop something up and leave the sample pretty much how I got it. Maybe change the pitch a little bit, do a few alterations to it, but it's pretty much going to be the full original sample, again, just chopped up into these individual pads. All right, let's get our sample in there. I'm going to go to Menu, click where it says Sampler. I need this to actually be mono coming in, but I want to be going into stereo. Make sure that the monitor's on. I usually like to give myself a little bit of lead time by arming the track and recording before I start, because you can always go back and trim out the parts you don't want later. So I'm going to start this recording and then start the playback.
Why did you do it if you know you didn't love me? No, you didn't love me. Why did you do it?
Okay, it's really easy to change the name of it. You can go up here, and I'm going to call this Classic Chop for our purposes. Do it, and I'm just going to edit it for now. So go straight to here. I am on the knobs where I can see on the screen, because then all these knobs now control what's happening up there. I can zoom in. You can see I have quite a bit of lead time in there that I don't really need. So I'm going to go to Trim. That's this button right here, and I'm going to trim up my start time just to get me a little closer. I wanted to start when the singing came in, so I'm going to come up to here. I'm just going to get rid of the beginning part, so I'm going to click on Process, under Discard, click Do It. Now I just cleaned up my sample a little bit, made it easier to work with. So then I want to go from Trim to Chop. Now it's time to put in our chops. You can do so by pressing this Slice button right here as it's playing. I think that's the fastest way to put it in. So I'm going to press play, and then I'm going to hit in the slices.
Why did you do it if you know you didn't love me? No, you didn't love me. Why did you do it if you know you didn't love me? No, you didn't love me.
All right, I made those actually a little bit sloppy, but that's a good chance to show you what to do here. So I'm going to take the cue and move that all the way back to the beginning so I can hear what started with.
Why did
I actually really wanted my first chop to be at that point. So rather than moving all of them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the cue right before that first point, and I'm going to put another slice here. After I did that, all the numbers moved over because all the chops are linear. So 1 goes to 2, goes to 3, and it moves its way across. If you insert another chop, it's just going to increase the number. So there was another point here when right here, put another slice. Okay, this is going to work much better. So there are two ways to go from here. You can either edit these chops in this particular view before you create a new drum track out of it, or you can edit it there, because again, it's non-destructive. So once we convert this to another track, we could go ahead and edit there, but I like to edit it here. So what I'm going to do is zoom in. I'm going to go select, there's a little headphones right up here in the upper right hand corner. If I click on the headphones, that allows you to touch the screen to hear each of the different sample points. So I'm going to make sure that they're cleaned up a little bit. So I'm going to move in a little closer, scroll over to the beginning. Alright, that's good enough for our purposes. Once you got a good feel for all these chops, that they're pretty much where you want them to be, again, you can change them later. You hit the Shift button and you push Convert. This is where you select to convert the new drum track using the slices. We want them to be non-destructive, and we don't want to create events because I'd rather play the pads rather than have the sequence be played by itself. Hit Do It, and now I just made a new track down here. If I click here, it's going to bring up my pads.
Why did you do it? No, you didn't love me, love me. Why did you do it? No, no, no.
Now after I get all the chops where I want them to be, that's when I might change perhaps the overall tune, maybe raise it up, or I might lower it.
Why did you do it? Why did you do it?
The other thing I might change, you may have noticed that sometimes some of this is cutting out, and that's because I'm not hitting the pad hard enough. To change the velocity on this, you're going to have to exit the sample edit, go back to the main menu here, click on Track Edit. Now when you choose to chop and convert samples like we, it's going to make all your pads mono. That means that whenever you play a new pad, it's going to automatically turn off the pad that was playing beforehand, even if it's not finished. Or in other words, it chokes them.
Why did you do it? Why did?
If you don't want it to do that, you could change it to maybe a certain number of polyphony. So if you do it to 2, then 2 pads are going to be allowed to play at the same time. If you do longer, and so on. It gets kind of messy though if you have too many that are playing at the same time. Because they're going to play all of them and continue to do so even if you push another pad. I usually like it to be on mono because that's the kind of classic chop sound. The next thing I generally want to do is adjust the velocity sensitivity so that it's not cutting off things by me touching the note accidentally and triggering a very quiet play of the sample. Something like that. So you go to LFO modulation, and I want to click up here on this little icon to edit all the pads at the same time. I don't want to go through each one and try to do that. I'm going to hit close, and I'm going to turn this down to maybe like, I don't know, 70%. That feels pretty good to me. Obviously, do that to taste. You could also go in here and change any number of other things related to individual pads or all the pads. Let's say that you wanted to change the envelope. Let me make sure I go back to the current pad first. Now remember, anything I'm doing here is changing the way that this pad plays the sample. The sample remains unchanged. If I want to go back to changing the sample itself, then I have to go back to menu and sample edit, and now I'm back to where my chops are. Now even though they call this the non-destructive slice option, you can still make a lot of changes per slice to these samples. You do so by this process button here on the right. Select the sample that you might want. You can push process, and if you double click on this screen, there are a number of different features that you can change. You can normalize it and make that particular section louder. You can reverse it, fade it in or fade it out. This is different than the fade in that we just were looking at with regard to the pad because it wasn't changing the sample, it was changing the quality of the pad. This, if you did a fade in here, would actually change the quality of that sample. So if you notice, I just changed this sample to fade in. And that particular chop has now been altered. I'm going to undo that for a second. See how that changed back. I can also do a number of things in here, like reverse it. And it's only going to reverse that particular slice. Now things can get a little tricky here once you start to process some of these individual slices, like put them in reverse or have them fade out. And here's why. This slice right here is now in reverse. But it's not this pad that is in reverse, it's simply this slice. So if I go up here and I change the start or the end time so that this pad right here no longer plays just that slice that we put in reverse. So now part of it's going forward and part of it's in reverse. You can see if you start to get a little crazy with processing some of these slices and then you change the start and the stop points of the individual pads, it could start to veer off from your original intention, which might be a cool effect, but that's just a heads up. So if you think you might want to change some of the slice points along here, maybe don't do some of the processing like the fade in and the fade out parts, because you can go over to the pad edit for the track edit and you can change the attack and the fading in and out on this one, which is a lot less destructive even though this is supposedly the non-destructive method. Once you get it here, you can actually destroy it quite a lot. Okay, so the second main way that I chop up samples is in a non-linear fashion, which is a fancy way of saying that I just pick and choose the samples that I want and then assign those to the pads that I want, instead of taking a longer sample and chopping that into sequential bits that are then assigned sequentially to the pads. Okay, let's get the sample back in here. It's good enough for now. Alright, now that the sample's in here, I take a different approach. I'm not going to add slices. I'm just going to immediately take this sample and put it on a specific pad. But I need to create a new track first. So I'm going to go down here, hold this down, add a new drum track, go back to my sample edit, find the one that I just created. Here we go. And I'm going to assign this to pad number 1 in this new track that I created, drum number 2. Okay, so now if I come here, okay, it's just going to keep playing it a long time. I'm going to need to come here, change this to a mono track so that I can hit another pad and turn it off. So now, at least it's not going to play forever again. Alright, now that I'm here, I'm going to go back into the sample edit. And so I also want to change the stop length. Move that down to something a little bit more reasonable. Alright, so in this approach, I just simply go through and figure out which sound that I want to be on which pad. So maybe I'll find something like just that first part of the beat here. Okay, and maybe I'll copy that to here, and now I'm just changing this next pad. Copy that to a new pad. and so on. You can start to add whatever you want to, or find whatever samples that you might like to spread those around and make a different arrangement. Again, I usually use this approach when I don't want it to be linear and have each slice moving its way across. One key thing to remember is that each of these pads here, even though I went and picked out the individual clips that I wanted to add to these pads, they're still all playing from the main sample that I recorded. So any sort of changes you do to the tune of this affects the other pads as well. Now, if you want to be able to take a sample, copy it to a new pad, and then be able to mangle it and change it without having it affect the original one, you're going to have to extract it to create a new sample entirely. The way that you do that is you click where it says Process, click on the function, and then the one you want is the one that says Extract. And when you're extracting something, you're creating an entirely new sample. You would then go to the name and name it something new. I'm just going to name it New Sample. And here's our original sample. I'm going to go to a new pad, come here, and find the sample that we created. They sound the same, but technically they're different samples. So anything that I do to one of them does not apply to both. Even if that means doing something crazy to it, like putting it in reverse or mangling it in some way. And the reason that that works is because I processed this original sample and extracted it to make an entirely different one. Okay, let's take a second here to summarize these two different approaches that I use and why that I use them. The first one, again, is this classic chop.
No, you didn't love me.
And I use this when I want to just get something on there real quick, and I also want to use kind of the full sample and have it be broken up into sequential pad arrangements. You can still go through and delete some of these if you want to, but I use this second approach when I really want to be a lot pickier about which piece that I grab, and I'm going to slowly build my selection instead of doing the slice method, which does it really fast. But I tend to use this when I just want to grab a couple different samples and put them in there instead of this longer phrase. If you found this video to be helpful, consider hitting the like button and leaving a comment, and subscribe if you want to be notified when the next Force Friday comes out, or just come back on a Friday because that's kind of when I'm going to be doing these videos. And if you have some suggestions on topics that you might want to have me cover, leave those in the comments below as well.